It's true that no person of color made the top two out of a 12-person field in Boston's preliminary mayoral race. But 5 of the 6 candidates of color earned a total of 34% of the vote, with Charlotte Golar Richie getting 14% of that herself. But as she told WGBH's Phillip Martin last night, she welcomed all candidates of color into the race, even if it meant splitting the vote.
I was not really opposed to having all of the candidates run. And in fact, before I got into the race, I looked at who might be interested and thought maybe, somebody who, if it were, to be honest, Council Presley or somebody else who had been in politics and government more recently, I might have decided not to bother, to do it, because I didn't want to see us bumping up against each other.
But there was bumping up nonetheless. Former school committee member John Barrows took 8% of the vote last night, due in part to an endorsement from the Boston Globe. If all of his votes had gone to Golar Richie, she would have been the top vote getter. Still, says Richie, she believes she broke ground.
I was finding that these undecideds were breaking my way. Very, very exciting. Every day, more and more people calling, emailing, coming into the offices saying, how can we get involved? But we kind of ran out of time. So we opened a door. We kicked open a door. And you know what? Now it's there for someone to walk through.
And Golar Richie sounds like she's ready to walk through another door herself, offering some words of wisdom to preliminary election victors Marty Walsh and John Connolly.
I know that the 2 candidates who prevailed are proponents of charter schools. I would want to have a conversation with them about that, because there are 57,000 students in our 127 Boston public schools that need our attention.
I'm joined now by WGBH News senior reporter Phillip Martin, who is a former race relations correspondent for NPR. Phillip, do you think she'd maybe be interested in school superintendent?
I think she would. Right? She's articulating the issue. There are a lot of issues, obviously, in this campaign, and the one that she seemed to gravitate toward is schools. And she feels that, that John Connolly, of course, has become a one-note candidate in terms of schools, but and she is still trying to stake out trying to understand what positions Marty Walsh seems to represent that she could basically influence. She wants to play broker in this upcoming general election, and she's in a position to do that to a degree. And I think that, but I think education is the issue that is most dear to her heart.
Cutting to the chase here, Phillip. Do you believe that Boston is not ready for a black mayor, or wasn't ready maybe for someone from this group of 6 of non-white candidates?
I think it's the latter. It's hard to argue that Boston isn't ready for a black candidate or a person of color across the board. It could be an Asian American. It could be a Latino. The reason I don't think we can argue that is when you juxtapose Boston with other cities around the country, most other cities have had persons of color. Large cities I'm talking about have had mayors of color, from Wichita to New York City, Jacksonville, Florida. You've had mayors of color. Whether they be Latino, African American, or Asian. So it's not a question, I feel, about whether or not Boston is ready, because all you need is a certain threshold of voters. Some voters will never be ready, of course, but quite a few are. They were ready to elect Barack Obama. They certainly were participated in electing Deval Patrick. So I think they are ready. I think from this group of candidates, however, I think they lacked money. I think that they organization was lost on some of the candidates. Let's be clear. And I think the other factor in this is that none could be considered what you might call transformational. There was not the personality, there was not the drive that you've seen in the past in some candidates. And furthermore, I think that there is an argument to be made about there being an overabundance of qualified candidates in this case.
There were, including many of those that we're seeing on the board there that didn't make the cut.
That's right. That's right. And I think, without question, each of these candidates would have preferred that the other drop out and get behind their candidacy.
All right. Let me broaden the discussion here a little bit and bring in Kenneth Cooper. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner and editor of the Trotter Review at UMass Boston, and Peniel Joseph, the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts University. You know, Kenneth and Penel, when you look at this, the entirety of this race last night, and you think about it, 65% of Bostonians didn't get the person that they wanted in office. So almost everybody voted for, more than half people voted for somebody who didn't win. And, we're going to talk to Governor Patrick in a minute, but, with a field that large, the winnowing process itself, I mean, when you really look at it, as I added up those, getting 34% from 6 candidates of color, some of whom were quite marginal, that's not bad.
Well, I think, the election result was pretty much so 20th century, and I don't think it takes a transformational character or candidate to actually win. It's kind of hard to make that argument in either the case of John Connolly or Marty Walsh. I think Charlotte Richie, has herself first to blame for running not just a bad campaign, but a lousy campaign. Mm-hmm. If she had ran a mediocre campaign, she very well could have made the cut. She misplayed her status as the only woman. I think she overemphasized it instead of making subtle appeals that would have won over better. There were organizational problems in her campaign. At my polling place, even Charles Clement had a sign outside, but Charlotte Richie didn't have one. And I think, her messaging, there's been a lot of criticism of that. I think she just didn't play to her strength. I mean, she was the city's housing chief. She should have owned that issue. And she could have connected it to crime, a safe neighborhood. She could have connected it to employment. You need a good job to own a home. Mm-hmm. And why she didn't do that baffled me. And I think either her campaign advisors weren't very good, or she was taking conflicting advice from lots of different people. So,
Penel, are you on board with this? It's not the race issue so much, it was the group of candidates running. I mean, there were some stellar candidates, John Barrows being one, Charlotte Golar, there was Felix Arroyo.
Well, no, I think race had something to do with this, but I think for the African American and Latino candidates, they could never get behind one candidate. So I think that Boston, in terms of the way local municipal politics have played out historically, they're in a different position now. It's a majority-minority city, but there's no power broker or community organization that could winnow these candidates out before they ran. So I think this morning, including white Bostonians, are disappointed that they only have Walsh and Connolly. Nothing against those candidates personally, but the city has been transformed from the bad old days of Boston busing in 1974 and segregation, or even '83 when Mel King makes a robust and historic run for mayor. This was the time, and this is a missed opportunity. This was a time where there was Charlotte Richie, John Barrows, Felix, to have a person of color be the next mayor of Boston. This was the time. And I think in the general election, if one person had made the cut, I think we would have seen people coalesce around that person. So I think this is a really missed opportunity, and it has to deal with the fact there's a lack of political maturity among people of color, their politics in Boston, to get behind one or two candidates and not really have a process of 6.
Couldn't you flip this around and say if there had been kind of a force move on some of those city councilors who, I mean, that really muddied the field too. I mean, that might have catapulted Charlotte Richie or John Barrows into another position if Rob Consalvo or Mike Ross or some of those people who had a different kind of appeal weren't in the race. I mean, Mike Ross, young, youthful, I mean, that could have transferred to someone else.
I think there should have been some level of negotiation amongst the candidates to, in fact, winnow out this wide array of candidates for sure. But I also think that Kenneth Cooper, made a point about a dominant issue seemed to be missing also from this campaign. I also wonder why housing, not just with Golar Richie, but in terms of the entire field, why housing never rose to the fore. I almost wanted to hear a rent is too high type of candidate, articulate, like something.
David Wyatt had a chance.
David Wyatt had a chance. He might have been comical, but everyone remembers the rent was too high. Yeah. And there was nothing that basically, we saw nothing transcendent in terms of issues in this particular campaign. The schools were on the table and are on the table. Crime, obviously, public safety has risen to the fore as an issue, particularly within communities of color, because it's seen as disproportionately targeted. But I think that you really could have, some of these candidates could have, I think, made a lot of hay, if you will, out of the issue of housing.
I want to go back at you, though, Kenneth, about the woman thing, because Philip and I were going back through the statistics today. I mean, in virtually, you heard him say, virtually every major American city in the country has had a black mayor.
Or black or person of color.
Person of color. I mean, you can count on one hand the number of women. So, I mean, for her to make a big deal of that seemed to be successful to her. I mean, there were a lot of women in certain circles who were saying, I'm going to vote for the woman.
I think she should have done it, but she should have been much subtler about it. I mean, she started early on. One reporter said, what do you think about there being only a woman in the field? And she said very subtly, well, at least there's one. When Ayanna Pressley was running, not this time, but the last time, and she did an appearance at a senior citizen center, and there was a lot of women, elderly women in the audience, and she made a comment like, now, ladies, I know you understand this. Somebody's got to keep these men in line. That's a very subtle gender appeal that goes across ideology. That's not just geared to feminists or womanists. You know, many women think that. So I think she should have played to women without hitting it so hard and being so obvious about it. I think the other thing, I mean, I think Peniel is right. The black community does lack a broker. I'm not sure it needs a broker to eliminate candidates like they do in clubhouse politics in New York City. But it certainly, they could have vetted all the candidates and endorsed one. And for people who had trouble sort of sorting through 12 candidates, they could have just went to this one trusted organization, saw their card and their endorsement slate, and know what to do. And be comfortable with that, but that was lacking. And therefore, I mean, you know, we can talk about how many candidates of color there were and how that hurt Charlie Golar Richie, but the truth of the matter is that 4,000 votes or so she needed to make the final. 3,000. She could have gotten out of the black community if the voter turnout there had been up just modestly from the low level that it was, lower than citywide.
By the way, I agree with you, Peniel. I think people are bummed in a way. And has nothing to do with these two fine candidates, but it's not exciting. It's so 20th century, as Kenneth put it. It's like it's not forward, and there's not really this great difference that you can just like really grab onto.
Yeah, and this is a real, again, lost opportunity, especially since the candidates were all relatively on the same page in terms of politics and policy-wise, right? Some articulated it better, some had better issues and better ways of speaking, but in terms of what they wanted to do for the city of Boston. So this is a really lost opportunity to really transform the state of Massachusetts and the city. Can you imagine having a woman of color, or the first Puerto Rican mayor, or the first Cape Verdean mayor, or you know, Charles Yancey, or somebody to change the way in which we think about Boston? It would have been incredible, and it would have been, that person would have been an incredible global ambassador.
Well, as they say, there's always next time.
20 years from now.
No, I bet there'll be somebody back in 4 years. Peniel Joseph, Kenneth Cooper, and Phillip Martin, thank you so much.